Good afternoon, everyone. I, Ankit, on behalf of NEN and Wadhwani Foundation, would like to invite you all for this webinar and also introduce our experts. Mr. Chandu Nair, co-founder Scope E-Knowledge, a pioneering knowledge process outsourcing KPO company. Chandu is a graduate in commerce from Madras University and a postgraduate in management from the Indian Institute of Management, Ahmedabad. He has over 28 years of experience in industry consultancy, business information and media. While his domain areas of focus were business development and fundraising, his passion was enterprise building and transformation. Chandu was part of the core leadership team that saw Scope transform itself from a boutique market research firm to an internet content portal to a KPO, as also scaling up from 40 people to about 1,000 professionals. In addition, Scope has also changed from being India-centric to having a global orientation and footprint. Scope has received angel, VC and strategic investor funding. In India, he has been a member of various industry panels in CII, Indo-American Chamber of Commerce, IACC, Institute of Management Consultants of India, IMCI, as also oversees professional bodies such as NFAIS, American Business Media, ABM, Licensing Executive Society, ALIS, and a Software and Information Industry Association, SIIA. He was also a visiting faculty in various business schools such as IIM Bangalore, IIM Kozhikode, IFMR, Open University UK, Bharatihar University MBA department, among others, something he does on and off nowadays. Before I hand over the floor to Mr. Nair, a quick note to all our attendees. You will all be on mute. You may ask questions by typing in the panel provided. Our expert will answer the questions after his presentation. Over to you, Mr. Nair.
Thank you, Ankit, and good afternoon who are there. I hope I'm audible. If I'm not, just let me know by typing. Thanks for taking the time off on a Wednesday afternoon to listen to a fairly dry but important topic of distributing equity to co-founders. First off, like many of you who are, I presume, entrepreneurs or wannabe entrepreneurs, I don't really think I'm an expert in the sense of being a financial expert with respect to equity. I think I've earned some of this expertise by my experience. So let me go on to the next slide. As Ankit mentioned, I've been an entrepreneur now for about 25 years in several businesses, in knowledge-related businesses, in the internet space, in fact, even in trading, even in education, and so on and so forth. And in most of these cases, these businesses started off by being self-funded, mostly with the co-founders themselves, and in some cases with partners. In the last several years, I've seen angel funding, I've seen venture funding, I've also seen strategic investor funding, each of which have required me to do various kinds of equity deals with financial investors, co-promoters, business partners, strategic investors. So a lot of the comments on my proposal of period and peace in mind. Now, what I understand today's webinar is going to do is for me to talk for about 20-25 minutes, and Ankit can correct me if I'm wrong, and then to throw the floor open for questions. Now, one of the things that happens when we are entrepreneurs and we start off on a new idea is this, that if you look at the entrepreneur or the entrepreneurs, especially at the very beginning, the ability as an entrepreneur, when you're starting off for the first time, is really quite unknown. You may believe that you have the ability, but it's still untested. Secondly, many times the idea or technology, the potential for it is really quite unknown. And to compound matters, the market, the purpose for which you're created, your offering, the demand for that, is also many times really unknown. And again, big challenge is getting the money, and finance availability often is also unknown. And if you have a team, especially of employees and all that, you're not sure about their expertise or of their confidence. That's also unknown. So if you look at it, at the very start, your formula for success really is very simply, if you add up all these things, is unknown. And what makes matters worse is that the statistics are against all of us. The statistics for success for most businesses are pathetic, like if you're lucky if you touch about 20%. So in such a case, how exactly does one go about minimizing all these uncertainties is the big challenge. So when you're grappling with basic problems, grappling with a bigger problem of how to share equity, a big problem like how to share equity, just adds sometimes to your worries, and you think, is it really worth it? So big issue here is, how can you even think with all these unknowns, does your mind even go to sharing the company or the spoils thereof? But anyway, these are things that one has to take care of. Okay, so let's move on to the next slide. I think one of the key challenges before you get into a discussion on equity is to understand very key people in this. One is yourself and your key promoters. I think a lot of times, a lot of people are not even aware of what is it they want to get out of a business. What is it that is really driving them to do this business? Yes, the idea is great, the passion is there. But then what? At the end of the day, what exactly are you in it for? And I think understanding a little bit of what kind of entrepreneur are you is very important. And I feel that there are various kinds of entrepreneurs. For example, if you take the local vegetable vendor kind of a person, he or she is really a necessity-based entrepreneur. Then there are some who are involuntary entrepreneurs, like family business guys who the next generation, the father says, boss, he tells the son, you have to come over and take over this business. And the son may not be interested, but many times he's forced into the business. The third is a lifestyle kind of a business, which is a business that just helps you maintain a certain lifestyle, your independence, your autonomy, etc. And the fourth is hopefully what we're talking about today is people who want to build, scale, and maybe sometimes even try and sell the business partially or fully. So I think the first thing is to understand what kind of entrepreneur are you, where do you fall into these categories, and also what really is your appetite for various things. The second thing is, many times just to ask yourself the question, are you the best guys to start the business, to run the business, manage the business? And thirdly, many times many of us as entrepreneurs forget to distinguish between what's good for the company or the enterprise and also distinguish the enterprise from the entrepreneur. Many of us take our identity on the enterprise, and I think those are things that I would request many of you to just ponder over a little bit, because that will also determine what you are really expecting from starting a business or working with other co-promoters. If you don't understand this, let me just try and see if I can get this. If I see this highlighter here, okay. Now you see this little thingy, whirring all the way. I don't know why it stopped right now, but that's really what we're talking about. You keep your mind working on this particular facet. And this is an important statement, I think is very wise for all of us to remember. Rockefeller was a very major American businessman. And he had this proposition, he had this quotation, which I thought was very interesting, having started businesses actually in the first instance with friends. His proposition was that a friendship founded on business is better than a business founded on friendship. It's a very interesting statement, and I ask you guys to just think about it a little bit. It has some meaning, and a lot of you might relate to it as you get with friends or friends from us. Now, one of the things that we have to consider out here, when we look at equity and what does each one get as in terms of his share in the company, one of course the one which comes on top of the mind is the money or the cash that each promoter invests into the venture. The second thing is the experience or expertise that each one of you has, which is of value to the venture. Now, in some cases, it could so happen that one or two of the co-promoters may have a significantly proven track record, and one must keep that in mind when one is looking at distributing equity. The third aspect is the time that each person spends or invests into the venture, and the fourth is the role that each person plays in the venture. Now, these are very possible criteria. Why I'm mentioning this is that many of us jump into the mechanics of or the percentages right up front. One of the common things that most of us do if you're co-promoters is to say this is a democracy and each of us will have an equal share. So that's a very common situation, and this is exactly what I did along with my friends many years ago when we first started our company. 5 of us, we said simple thing, all of us are pals, we all have a similar background, all of us should get the same thing. But as subsequent events panned out, it's not maybe the best way to approach things, okay? But so keep these as some criteria, the most important criteria. Now let's take a little bit of deep dive into each of these criteria. Let's take money. One of the easiest things about money is that it's the easiest thing to quantify. You can't argue with the amount of money that's in the bank. You can't argue with the amount of money that's been placed by somebody else. Now, in some cases, the money can also be, in terms of the salary taken or not taken, because sometimes some people need a salary because of various reasons. Some people may say, I don't want a salary, and that salary can be offset against some share of equity. So one aspect is the money that one kind of puts into the business right up front or over a period of time in different ways. The second thing is the experience and expertise, and this is sometimes a tougher call, because who says which experience and expertise is of more value, which is of less value. Now this is a tough call. One way, if you want to be completely mercenary, is to see what could be each person's annual salary or whatever it is. Now here it can so happen that somebody is working in a big MNC and somebody else took a call to work in a smaller startup, but maybe the guy within the smaller startup, though he's getting a lesser salary, may actually be the one with the better expertise. So please be a little careful when you're doing something like this. One has to also sufficiently look at the softer aspects of this. And like I mentioned earlier, if somebody has a great track record, you might want to keep that person happy because he or she brings something very special to the table. For example, tomorrow you're starting an internet business, and somebody like Rajan Anandam of Google India, the head of Google India, says, look, I'm stepping out of Google, but I'm coming in. And, how do you kind of, he's a co-promoter, how do you kind of give him a percentage based on his track record, because the company's value could kind of rise because that such a person is coming into the company. So you might want to consider that as well. The third way is the amount of time. Again, this is a tricky thing. If you look at a classic consultant type approach, one would look at a timesheet kind of an orientation, but a lot of us know that, is it just the quantity of time, or is it the quality of time? So I would say that those are things that, again, as you can make out, each of these seem to be on the surface very easy, and one can quickly make it a very arithmetical exercise. But in reality, each of these can be actually points of discussion which can get really time-consuming, but really, bog you down. And the fourth aspect is the roles that various people can play. For example, somebody might be the guy who came up with the idea, the innovator. But somebody else could be the guy who brings that, converts that idea into a prototype, and somebody else can really scale up that prototype. So there are different roles. Somebody else can take it to market. Somebody else knows how to get the money from various guys. So what are these various roles? Each role has an importance. So what do you, as a group of co-promoters, perceive the value of each role for that particular situation that you face? Also, a very important thing here is, a lot of us know that democracy is fine, but sometimes in many cases, even investors like to see somebody who is inverted comma seen as the boss, in some sense. So who's the first among equals? And that can all play some kind of a role in determining how you go about evaluating each criteria. So one of the things now to do here is, from your point of view, if you look at your situation, take each of these aspects. Ask yourself, first and foremost, what is the weightage you might want? Which aspects matter? Second, what is the weightage that you might give to each of these aspects? And third, in your particular case, how do you apply these weightages, for each person? If you take person A and you take person B and you look at them on these 4 parameters, how would you start measuring it and quantifying it? And then when you look at the numbers multiplied by 100, 100 being the total equity that's available, how would the numbers look like, and are you comfortable with that number, or would you keep calibrating it? That's an interesting way of perhaps looking at this particular and very tough problem to solve. So as I mentioned here, the weightage is always a bit of a challenge. Now, one of the key things I find that's very useful, and which is not very usually done by many entrepreneurs in a very happy way, is the thing about communicating. And I think what I find of value, recently I was involved with a bunch of medical professionals who are planning to start a new venture, and as a kind of a third-party advisor. And initially, because all these, when you look at professionals like those, each of them comes with a certain expertise. Would a surgeon be more important than a physician? how do you say he's more important? Why do you say he's more important, etc. Secondly, what kind of what should I say? What kind of stakes do you give each person? Who should be the boss of the whole venture in some sense, the overall titular head or what have you, and what could be the structure of the organization? So one of the things that we found useful at the end of the day was to actually start defining the roles and putting it in some form of a structure. Look at the contributions that one can make, what value that each role brings to the enterprise. And then also look at, from a personal point of view, what makes sense, what could be motivators or demotivators. So what we ended up at the end of the day was creating some kind of a founder's charter. I will come to it a little bit more if one wants to get into that. But these are some questions, so have a discussion about it. The second thing is, in the initial phase, especially if you're looking at investors in a later stage, many investors are happy if the initial stage, the initial stage can range anywhere from 6 months to 12 months or even more. There's a company I'm advising now where the promoters haven't taken a salary for over 18 months. So the first question to ask is, will you take a salary or no salary? Will all or take a salary or some take a salary? And how do you differentiate, and what value will you place on this person who's taking a lesser salary or no salary? Why is having a discussion important? First and foremost, it tells you what the importance of various roles are, what value you place on various contributions, okay, and how you can assign some weightage to it. But the most important facet about this is the clarity that it brings to each one of us as to these various facets of a business, number one. And finally, each of you feels responsible and feels accountable and owns, in some sense, the share that you finally get. You know how you arrived at it. You're quite clear why the other guy is getting less or more. And you're quite okay with it. You accept it. It actually, by doing these discussions, you're avoiding potential minefields later on in life. Another interesting, but it's not exactly a material point here, but please also, at this point in time, might want to worry a little bit about designations. Each of us might say, we are happy just being called a co-founder. Once you reach a certain level, you can call yourself a chief mentor or tormentor, partner or vision holder or what have you. But in the beginning, it doesn't make sense because you don't even have a company which is making money. So you might want to just think about something which makes sense to the marketplace, to the customers, to your employees, to other stakeholders outside. Now, this is typically what happens. I mentioned about this concept of equality. But as you know, there are different roles, there are different contributions, there are different kinds of things that different people do. But the tragedy is many of us tend to approach many issues this way. Now, this is just in a lighter vein. But what happens is that all of us are different creatures out here, like the elephant or the seal or the dog or the monkey or the penguin or what have you. But then typically we say everybody takes the same exam, and you please climb that tree. This doesn't work actually. Approaching it like this, because everybody is really not equal in many ways. So appreciating this fact that we are not the same, we have different things to bring to the table, but then you can't apply therefore the same yardsticks all the time. Okay. So this is why, just put in a lighter vein. So you need different strokes for different folks. Building or land or resources of some sort, actually giving hardcore resources which one can see, touch and feel in many cases, is much more important than intangible contributions, particularly in the initial stage when one is trying to get the idea off the ground. I must also warn you here or caution here that there are contextual and cultural differences between different places. For example, you may get much greater weightage in the US for an idea as opposed to a place like India. This is a very broad, sweeping, a very wide, and a sweeping statement I'm making. But by and large, I believe this to be true. The second thing is, yes, somebody may have greater capacity to bring money, but all of it need not be taken in the form of equity or equity which is the highest. You don't want to make it that you're giving up the company too cheap in the initial phase. So if you have a discussion, you can even arrive at ways and means by which you tell the other person, boss, this much, if you don't mind, we'll take as equity. The rest of it can be like a loan. Now here the issues will need to be, then that guy is bringing more monetary skin into the game. So you'll have to figure out ways by which, in case something goes wrong, how will you, or even if things go right, how will you repay it? How will you make sure that if things go wrong, still he gets repaid in some form, at least for the loan? Will there be a guarantee or a promissory note or an IOU? So these are some questions you might want to think of. But if you have real faith in your idea and you think there's considerable traction you will get, then I think this is something that you might want to consider, that somebody who has the capacity to bring greater money, greater tangible contributions. How do you kind of, not get into a loan? The thing is also that the nature of the business also determines the intensity and the importance of this issue. If it's a very capital-intensive venture, for example, you're setting up a power plant, then it's better to determine the equity distribution pretty early on, because there's a lot of money going in, there's a lot of resources being brought to the table. But if it's a soft venture, very ideas-based, a few computers here or there, and friends getting together at night and putting things together, I might say, don't really worry too much about distribution of equity in the initial phase. Have maybe some broad guidelines, but let the venture grow first, before you kind of jump into discussing equity. So there's no point, even before, for example, you say hi to a person of the opposite sex. I'm hoping that most of you are guys, but imagine if you say, even before you said hi to a girl, you're already wondering where you'll go on a honeymoon, something like that. Now, another big challenge which happens, and it happens quite often, is a situation like this. What do you do if a co-founder who has equity walks away after 6 months or even earlier? So one of the things to also do while you're discussing this is to have certain guidelines, do the promoters or the company buy it back? If so, what kind of valuation? Because at different points in time there could be different types of value for the company. Or can you look at it this way, that you allot only initially a certain percentage of equity? For example, you say, I only have a 1 lakh authorized and paid up capital in the initial stage. We'll only distribute this 1 lakh equity related thing after we reach these milestones. Milestone 1 is this. We look at allocating the next stage of equity. Why that makes sense? Because each of you then stays vested and invested in the enterprise in terms of not just money, but in terms of your time, energy, and your focus. So this is another thing that one can consider doing. Don't look at allotting all of it up front, but have mechanisms by which you can even determine the contributions, determine the importance of of the role. So you're kind of testing the waters at each phase, and you're also making it milestone dependent. So that you're not really boiled the ocean in the first instance itself and had too much of a needless discussion. But like the Kannadigas say, Solpa adjust madi, right from the train to the bus or any other things, there are many adjustments and compromises which will be made in the actual process. And the predominant reason, especially in a culture like India, is human factors. Finally, he's your dom mate, your hostel friend, or whatever else. And you say, look, boss, I understand, you have this motivation issue, you have this demotivation issue, or sometimes there could be a jealousy factor coming in, you get worried about that. You might make some adjustments and compromises. The way to counter that, like I mentioned, is what I mentioned earlier, that don't allot all of it right up front, do it phase by phase, milestone by milestone. Some of this angst or these kind of, personal, emotional issues, which I find many of us Indian entrepreneurs, I'm talking because we are all sitting here, many of us entrepreneurs here tend to get many times too emotional even about a very factual thing like money. And we think that shares represent money in some sense, if not money today, but money tomorrow. So it's wise for us to try and be a little more rational and more, have a lot more equanimity. And doing it phase by phase is one way of understanding this, okay? But I would request that many of us take money as an input and look at this as just a very important symbolic way of representing our ownership and our reward in the company. At the same time, let it not get too emotional. Many of us tend to, as I mentioned, stake our identities on many of these things, and we kind of lose a bit of perspective or sight. So if you look at it, at the end of the day, there's no one-size-fits-all for every company. It's very case-by-case kind of a situation. The good thing to do here is to look at the criteria, look at some of these guidelines, have some mechanisms, and try and do it phase by phase. That's what I would think, okay? And therefore, let's take a quick final check. It is important to be sure. First, is your approach to distributing equity soundly based? what criteria are you using, what weightages are you giving to it, and how do you apportion it to each person based on this. Second, especially it is important for us as entrepreneurs to understand ourselves a little bit. So take a little bit of time to understand how important is this to you and how much can each of you compromise, make adjustments in this process. Third thing is the plan, the proposition for equity distribution. Does it look realistic to you? When you look at the numbers, when you look at it over a period of time, when you look at it, does it look realistic and make sense to you? And finally, are all the key expectations of key founders aligned in line? It's very important because if somebody just knows, a lot of us are what I say that we disagree, we will also not say that we agree. And even a little upset is we think the other fellow is devaluing us by giving us a lesser percentage, or we think we have been devalued if the percentage for us is lower than for somebody else, even though we have seen the process, and we don't then mention it, but we carry it in us in some form as resentment. That doesn't help. So it's best for us to make sure that expectations are communicated and are aligned, because if as co-founders, if our expectations are not aligned, I can bet that your company will find it difficult to grow even if you have the best kind of an idea. So with this, I kind of conclude the presentation, the formal presentation, taken about 25 minutes, I presume, and I'll now throw the floor open for some quick questions.
So we'll move to the Q&A session now. And our first question is from Sir Raghav. What is the process by which the angel or VC equity share will get diluted?
Let me understand the question, Raghav. You are saying, I think what you're saying is when there are co-founders who have invested a certain amount of time and it's 100%, and an angel comes in, then what percentage of share will the angel get? Correct? Is that the question? Because the angel comes in usually after the first co-founders have sort of come in. So I'm taking that as the question. Usually what happens is that when you talk to an angel, it depends the stage of company or the stage of the enterprise. Is it at the very early idea stage? Many people, then you're giving up too much of the company. You will tend to give more weightage, like I mentioned, to money at the very early stage. But if you give it at a little later stage, when already you have the prototype, maybe one proof of concept, the chances are you'll give up lesser of the company. But in general, a very early stage investor like an angel tends to get a higher percentage. A later stage investor like a VC type of person tends to get a lot lesser percentage. However, it's very wise for you to figure out not just the percentage, but also the quality of the investor that you're getting. That's the broad statement I would make. I hope I have kind of answered it. If I have not, Raghav, feel free to kind of send a clarification.
Our next question is from Mr. Lokesh. How is salary connected to the share in the company?
Okay, now if you'll take my example, there were 5 of us who first started a company. Now, of the 5 of us, 3 of us, had some family commitments. 2 of us did not have family commitments, for example. Now, obviously, so we said we need not take a salary because we could manage even without the salary from the company. But the others needed a basic salary from the company. So in some ways, if the other 2 who are not taking a salary are giving up a certain percentage, a certain monetary reward. So let's take this equity thing as a sub-step, okay? The larger step really is what monetary rewards are you getting from this enterprise? So one part of the reward is your stake in the company, your equity stake. Another part is a kind of salary. A third part could be incentives or bonus because of the performance of the company. So if you look at it, in some way these are all interlinked parts of a broader monetary reward. So if I am giving up, say, a monetary reward like immediate salary, how do you make it up to me? Now, this is where the compromises come. One way is to say no linkage to equity, but some people will say in the initial stage, this is a huge amount of skin I'm bringing to the game. So I think I need to get some equity. So this all depends on between the co-promoters, how they arrive at it. Do they consider it a notional contribution to the company because he's not taking money out of the company. That's why, Nitesh, there is some linkage here. If you look at it as monetary reward from the enterprise. I hope I'm answering your question.
Next question is from Mr. Rahul. How about web-based startups where the investment is not too much, but there is a technical co-founder?
Yeah, like I mentioned, in the initial stage, I said if it's a very resource-intensive kind of enterprise, then it's better to have this kind of equity discussion earlier. But if it is not a very resource-intensive enterprise, it's an ideas enterprise where you can just do it with computers or the laptops that you already have, then I think the more important thing will be the relative roles that are being played. If you take a web-based startup, classically many of us think that the guy who is designing various things, etc., the technical level can initially hire, but it was great. How do you develop? And also, or even sometimes a more important role for the guy who traffic to the website, to the portal, or to whatever you've designed. So even if there is a technical co-founder, like I mentioned, if he has a better track record, you might want to give him a little more because he's already been there, done that, and there are people convinced about his track record. So like I mentioned, it's the amount of weightage you give to that role. Now there are different roles which can get prominence over different points in time. Initially it could be the technical role, later on it could be the financing role, it could also be the business development role sometimes. So I think it's a little, like I said earlier, it's a case-by-case thing. You might want to reward him in different ways by giving different weightages. It's a very, I'm not giving you a very definitive answer, but if you want a more definitive answer, one can always talk about it offline, Rahul.
Okay, our next question is from Mr. Tandon. Can you please share an example of how we can do the phase-by-phase implementation of angel investing? How do we determine the phases?
Okay, now this is something which is, what we did in one of the companies that I'm working with is we said initially we will take it from what we call the money will be only from ourselves, which is the co-promoters themselves, and immediately thereafter what they call the triple F, the family, friends, and fools. I mean, fools are, they just use that word just to think that you can con anybody and they invest money to you. At that level, you get it at virtually near zero because it's still at a very idea kind of a stage. The best thing, in my view, to do after you finish a self-funding stroke family funding or friends funding is to say that it is to say these are the key milestones that I'm going to achieve. For example, if I'm right now at an idea stage, when do I reach a prototype stage? Now you might design a prototype. Like I've met N number of entrepreneurs who say they have got the next big portal. Now today if somebody comes to you and says, I've got the next big Facebook, will you be trusting him? You won't be trusting him so much because you know that Facebook has got such tremendous traction that unless you're some Chinese related Facebook site which is also there, it's very difficult for you to kind of make a breakthrough. So the first thing to ask is, even if it's a prototype, have you validated that prototype? Have you made sure that that prototype is getting some kind of initial traction? If you get somebody with just a product which does not have too much of a differentiator, so the first thing is, what is the offering that you have? If that offering that you have is of a substantially order of magnitude making a big difference to a big problem, then an angel will be prepared to fund you even at an idea stage. There are today angels who are prepared to fund you even at that stage. Lesser in India, more in a place like the US. So if you make it milestone based, Kannan, you can find that you give up much lower equity. If you want me to get into specifics of the percentage, I can't, because at different points in time, different types of ideas have different kinds of traction. So if you take right now, as compared, if you take 10 years ago, KPO business like the one I ran had a lot more traction. But today, if you look at it, a KPO business has lower traction, lower attraction to an investor as opposed to, say, a very interesting education-related business. Education again has come down in certain places because there are too many guys. So you'll find now healthcare has got some more traction. So you'll find at different points in time, different things getting traction. I would say make your milestones very distinctive, identify the valuation that you want from each milestone. There will be a lot of give and take at this stage because a lot of things are not proven. And the closer you get to proof of concept and revenue, the better your bargaining power can, the more you can ask for in terms of money, and the lesser you will have to give up in terms of percentage.
Okay, our next question is from Jainath Kumar. Does the equity of everyone involved get diluted when any fundraising is successful?
Usually yes, because it stands to reason, unless, like I mentioned, you are following a schedule, like you say that based on contributions, this is the percentage. But usually, if you take that, everybody, all promoters are 100, and there is somebody bringing in more money, yes, the short answer is yes, you will get diluted.
Okay, our next question is from Mr. Paresh. I have a little different case. Want to know if you have any specific idea. It was a company I started as freelancer. Later we grew. Lot of people joined me in between, and I promised them equity at after about 3 years. They contributed well, and few left as well. Anything specific suggestions that I can carry? Commitment is something I need to include as well.
Okay, now this Paresh, I know the first thing to ask is, did they come to you as employee type of people or people who had notions of being a co-promoter? I think first is to understand that if they are employee type of guys, then you might want to look at it as part of an ESOP pool. But if there is a commitment made by you that they are co-promoters, then you might want to treat them a little differently. A third way of doing it is, if you are already on your way to have traction and you are getting monies out of it, and you're getting monies from the enterprise, you're earning revenues, is to kind of compensate them in money terms in some other fashion and honor that commitment. So this is a very quick set of responses, Paresh. If he came in as co-promoter, I think, like I mentioned earlier, the first thing to understand is the expectation that you both have. If you expect him to stay on for a certain period of time, so when the going gets tough, a lot of people get going out of the company. Okay, it's only the really tough guys who stay behind and get going for the business. So if you had an expectation that he would stay, but he does not honor that, this is where I talked about having guidelines. What happens if a co-founder leaves after 3 months or 6 months? Irrespective, at the time of when he left, you promised that he would get a certain value or certain thing of equity. One way is to honor that and say, at which stage will you kind of take back the equity? Will you take it back right now? It may make sense for you to take it back right now when the valuation is much lower because he left right now, but agree to pay it a little later, maybe with a percentage interest on the amount due. Okay, I would not ideally like you to wait for an angel to come because you are doing all the hard work right now, growing the enterprise and the value of the enterprise. He's not there. But he should then be participating in the increased value of the enterprise when the angel comes, and that becomes the basis for valuation. I don't think that's fair to the people who have stayed behind. I hope that answered your question, Paresh.
Now, our next question is from Mr. Raghav R. I wish to know how the rather high percentage of the angel he took initially would come down once the business goes from proof of concept stage to implementation.
Oh, once you give up something, to somebody, like you've seen, even if you have holidays in a company, once you declare certain holidays, very difficult to take them back. It's really, really very tough. The one way out is for you to hope that you get a next round of funding. And you discuss that with the VC or the Series A funder or somebody else, and in that process, you renegotiate the terms with the new investor and make the angel exit. Otherwise, it's very difficult once, because you must understand there's also a legal implication here. When you're starting a company, and I'm presuming that when you're talking about shares, it has to be a private limited kind of company at the very least. Now, there are forms to be filled up which says each person has this many shares, etc., etc., and that's got to be filed with somebody called the registrar of companies. So at any stage in time, when you say you want to reduce the percentage of a guy, or increase, it obviously means you're increasing either the number of shares to other persons. So if you are making a term sheet with an angel, that at that time it is very wise for you to say, at this point in time you are having this weightage. Okay. The second thing which I told you, which is the easier thing to do, don't call the money as equity in the first instance. Take money as partly equity and partly a loan. But if you've already done it, it seems a little difficult for you to get out of it. And the easiest way I would say is if you get a bigger funder, and the bigger funder is you renegotiate the deal in such a way that you retain a bigger percentage and you provide an exit for the angel. It's like this: when you marry, you will get a mother-in-law most of the time. You can't say I don't want the mother-in-law after you get married.
Okay, now we have a next question from Mr. Naresh Kumar. In an idea-based business without tangible assets, how to convince a person to consider his investment as debt rather than equity?
So it's a tough ask, and this is where you should know the persons reasonably well. And how do you get to know people? I think one of the things many of us as entrepreneurs don't do enough of is to build networks. We typically, especially when we're younger, tend to build networks only among our own friends. But I am a member, for example, of TIE, T-I-E in Chennai, and there are very powerful networks of TIE in Bangalore, Bombay, Delhi, in about 17 cities. There are also, meetings like VC Circle, which is having a meeting, for example, I think in Mumbai on December 12th, where you get to meet a lot of angels and investors and VCs and all that. If you meet a few people a few times at such events, whether it's the Thai local chapter or even sometimes an open coffee club or a startup Saturday, you get to places where you are likely to meet other people like you who are searching for funds and get their experiences from you. The second thing is to also go to places where such investors are likely to come and keep talking to them. Apart from if you know friends who might support you, if you get people who are interested in a particular space, for example, I know people who are very interested essentially in the internet e-commerce and mobile app space. They would like to invest in that, but they also want to make sure that the person who the idea has the right expertise, background, energy, and the passion, the will to do it. Okay, so the thing is to build your network. The more you are able to network of people who start believing in you, it's easier to then convince them that, look, don't take everything as equity, take something as equity and something as debt. The second thing is I would also ask you to examine whether the possibility of going to an incubator may be better for you in the initial phase. You might find the incubators may just charge you sometimes something. For example, in Bangalore, you have the NS Raghavan Center for Entrepreneurship in IIT Bangalore, or an incubator in IIIT. In Chennai, you have the Anna University KB Chandrasekhar Incubation. You have the IIT Madras Research Center Incubation Center, and you have the University of Madras itself, which has an incubation. And there are also in the private kind of parties like the Startup Center. So you might want to look at, in the initial phase with an idea-based business, don't look at an angel, look at an incubator or an accelerator. Okay, these are funny names, but there are these creatures do exist. You may also in some cases get a grant. There are at least 2-3 ministries which give you a grant. Okay, and 4, there is also a central government scheme which many banks run, which is called the CGTSME, which is basically a collateral-free loan. It can go up from 5 lakhs to 25 lakhs to even 1 crore if you've already taken a loan more than one. It can go up to 1 crore even, where it's a completely collateral-free loan. It takes a lot more procedural documentation. So my request here is, in the initial stage, if you are very unclear, maybe don't go to an angel itself. Go to these incubators or accelerators, or you go to these, examine a grant or subsidy, or look at a collateral-free loan, whether you qualify for those things. Secondly, build your network and get people who believe in you. They may be more flexible than people you don't know. I hope that answered your question.
Okay, next question is, does equity distribution becomes compulsory at the time of company registration? If not, how long can this be delayed?
See, equity is not required if you are setting up, you don't have to mention all these details if you're not a private limited company, if you're just a partnership, etc., etc. Now, you can start a company even today. You can just create a letterhead even and start a company. It can be a sole proprietorship or partnership. Legally speaking, you have registered partnerships and unregistered partnerships. All these can work. The moment you put up a name, there are some kinds of legal obligations depending on the nature of the company. But by and large, for a partnership, you may not necessarily need to specify. But the reason to at least discuss it and put it in some form, like I mentioned earlier, it's important to have communication and clarity of thought. At least have that, Otherwise, tomorrow you'll say, oh, that fellow cheated me. It's very easy to say that. So I would just say at least have the clarity of thought. First, determine the nature of the company, the legal nature, whether it's a partnership, a proprietorship. It usually you're talking about a partnership, in which case you really don't need to register it necessarily. If it's a private limited or public limited company, yes, then there is a certain level of requirement at some point in time very quickly for you to say who are the 2 or 3 directors of the company and who are the initial shareholders of the company. That you need to put. You can even put a bare minimum, if you want to avoid the discussion, you can put a bare minimum like 1 lakh rupees or something like that and just put a token amount for each person and postpone the discussion.
Okay, now we'll quickly take last 2 questions of the day. Yes, your next question is from Ms. Ruchi. Yes. What is the usual equity given to founding team members in India, not co-founders?
Okay, I presume when you say founding team members, these are employees. Okay, I'm taking it like that, and they're not co-founders. I think the first thing to say here is what percentage will you give to key talent? Some people usually, I find most companies tend to restrict it between 10 to 15%, because what they say is the team member who's there in the beginning is getting a salary, and usually it may be a market salary, I'm presuming, or at least some discount to market salary. Now, market salary is a very wide term, because the same guy doing the same job may get a different sum if he's working, say, in Madras software, which is around the corner, as opposed to working in, say, Infosys, as opposed to working in some global multinational company having a big center. Okay, you'll find the same job has different salaries. So whatever the market salary that you determine, I hope you're paying him that. In which case he will fall in what we would call the employee stock pool. Now, how much of an incentive it is in the initial stage, I'm not so sure, because for such founding team members, unless they stay longer in the game and the company gains traction and value, these shares are nothing but paper. So I think it's important to recognize that these things like a stake and all really gain credibility when the company has attained some critical mass. You can, however, make some commitment to some of these people by having a broad pool, and the pool can be ideally through a trust. Hello?
Yeah, we'll take last question of the day.
Yeah.
It is from Mr. Paresh Masade. Can you help with some insights on tax implications on shares?
This is a separate topic, Paresh, because I've gone through all these stages, and there are some new rules which are coming. For example, thanks to some of these politicians issuing shares at such inflated premium, and such inflated value, I don't want to take names, but certain politicians from, say, Andhra or even in Tamil Nadu have created companies where monies were paid at very inflated prices and people subscribe to the equity of these companies. So today, if you have a very high premium, suppose a 10 rupee share is valued at 500, then technically speaking, like for 490 rupees can be treated as if it's income in the hands of the company, okay, and taxed as business income. Now that's one big challenge. A lot of people are trying to get clarity on this, because if this does really happen, a lot of early stage investing can be in deep trouble. There are implications here. There are also implications if you sell equity at a premium. There's something called capital gains, which is applicable. And there are a whole bunch of legal and tax implications, Paresh. It's a really very technical and a lot more involved subject. I'm afraid I can't get into all the aspects. I can get into some of it, and that also requires a chartered accountant who's dealing with this matter.
Thank you very much, thank you very much, Mr. Nair, for that interesting session. Thank you to all our attendees, and we are glad that the questions kept coming. And please do send in your feedback and suggestions to us at eclub@anianglobal.org. Also, if you found the session interesting, feel free to blog or post about it. The recorded version of the webinar will be available on our website eclub.anianonline.org by tomorrow. Do join us for our next webinar on getting into the mind of the Indian angel investor. Expert Mr. Ajit Khurana, educationist, angel investor, mentor and digital marketer. 12th of December from 3 p.m. to 4 p.m. Thank you once again and have a nice evening.
Thank you. Bye-bye.